In 1997, in a quiet Canadian town, an act of shocking teenage cruelty unfolded that would become a national tragedy. It's a case that raised some incredibly tough questions for an entire country. Today, we're going to delve into the heartbreaking story of Reena Virk. And that right there, that quote from author Rebecca Godfrey, it just hits you, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the disbelief that echoed across Canada. The crime was one thing, it was brutal, but the setting, this peaceful, almost sleepy little town, it just made it all feel impossible. And it's that contrast that made so many people ask, how on earth could something like this happen here? So, to even begin to grasp the tragedy of what happened, we first have to understand the life of the person at the center of it. We need to know who Reena Virk was. Reena was just 14 years old, and she was, caught in a really tough spot. Her family were Jehovah's Witnesses, which kind of made them outsiders in their local South Asian community. On top of that, she was bullied at school, and like so many kids that age, she was just desperate to fit in, to find her people. This desperate need for acceptance led her to rebel, and she started looking for it in a crowd that would turn out to be incredibly dangerous. Her life was already so complicated. At one point, she even ended up in provincial care after falsely accusing her father of abuse, a really desperate act that she later took back. She was just a vulnerable kid looking for a place to belong. The whole tragedy really unfolded on one single Friday night. What started as a teenage hangout under a bridge spiraled into an act of just unspeakable violence. The events of that night happened in two distinct, horrific phases. First, under the Craigflower Bridge, a dispute broke out and it led to this awful group attack, what's sometimes called swarming. A group of 8 teenagers, mostly girls, just viciously beat Reena. They punched her, they kicked her, they even put out a cigarette on her forehead. After that first assault, the group just kind of scattered, leaving Reena there, badly hurt. But it wasn't over. As she stumbled away trying to get home, 2 of the teenagers, Warren Glowitsky and Kelly Ellard, followed her. They attacked her a second time, and this time they dragged her into the water and drowned her. It would be 8 long days before her body was found. While the crime itself was just horrifying, the legal process that followed, well, it turned into its own complex and drawn-out nightmare. Getting any kind of accountability for Reena's murder would end up taking more than a decade. You see, while some of the teenagers involved in that first attack faced justice pretty quickly, the path to convicting her actual murderers was anything but simple. The case against Kelly Ellard, in particular, became this absolute marathon of trials, appeals, and legal challenges that just seemed to go on forever. Just look at this legal journey for Kelly Ellard. It's astonishing. She was first convicted back in 2000, but that got overturned on appeal. So they have a second trial in 2004. That one ends in a hung jury, a mistrial. They go for a third trial in 2005 and get another conviction. But then, believe it or not, that conviction gets overturned by an appeal court in 2008. It literally took until 2009 for the Supreme Court of Canada, the highest court in the land, to step in, reinstate the conviction, and finally bring this whole thing to an end. So what was the problem? Why all the delays? Well, the entire case nearly unraveled because of a really technical point of evidence law. Basically, the defense was arguing that a key witness had made up their story over time. To fight that, the prosecution wanted to show that the witness had told the exact same story from the very beginning. Now, normally you can't do that in court, but there's a tiny exception if someone is accused of recent fabrication. The Supreme Court had to decide if the judge made a small mistake or a huge one in allowing this evidence. It's just a fascinating peek at how one little rule can threaten to undo a decade of work. Okay, so after all of that, all the trials, the appeals, the years and years of legal battles, where did the dust finally settle? Who was ultimately held responsible for what happened to Reena Virk? So accountability came on a couple of different levels. First, you had the Shoreline 6, the girls from that initial beating. They were convicted of assault. Then for the murder itself, Warren Glowitsky was convicted of second-degree murder. He later expressed a lot of remorse and even took part in a restorative justice process with Reena's parents, and he was eventually granted parole. And then finally, after that unbelievable legal saga, Kelly Ellard's conviction for second-degree murder was made final by the Supreme Court. But the impact of this case went so far beyond the courtroom. It became a cultural touchstone, something that forced conversations all across Canada about issues that were, frankly, often hidden away from view. The murder of Reena Virk really left a deep scar on the Canadian consciousness. It kicked off what some people called a moral panic about violence among teenage girls. The case has been looked at from almost every angle imaginable, in books like Rebecca Godfrey's incredible Under the Bridge, and in Reena's own father's memoir, where he criticized the systems that he felt had failed his daughter. The power of this story is pretty clear in how it keeps being retold, in plays, in poetry, and even a recent TV miniseries. It just forced a whole generation to confront the brutal reality of bullying and the dark side of that teenage desire to belong. And that really is the central question this case leaves us with, isn't it? The trials are over, the sentences have been served, but Reena Virk's story, it endures. It forces us to ask what we owe to the most vulnerable people in our communities and how a whole system can fail a child who just wanted to fit in. It's a question that feels just as urgent today as it did all the way back in 1997.